Working in a morgue is not the kind of job we dream of as children. But sometimes life decides for us, and this was clearly the case when a person was doing the wrong thing. Bruce was annoyed by almost everything in his work, and probably that's why he was almost stripped of his license several times. He received a lot of reprimands and had a terrible reputation. Debts were pressing, savings were running out, the crisis was collapsing the stock markets, and of course it all affected the fact that he gladly agreed to go as a pathologist to some godforsaken hole in Idaho. It was a job where he would have to combine several duties for a meager salary, but what else was left to do? He loaded all his modest belongings into the pickup and drove west, just like his ancestor settlers once did. The road was long, it was drizzling, the autumn wind was blowing in gusts, but finally Bruce turned onto a one-lane road that led to a town lost between the forests. It was getting dark. Cold shadows lay between the trees and fog piled up from the humidity. Bruce felt tired after 9 hours of continuous driving and was focused on the road, but at some point he noticed movement in the forest out of the corner of his eye. He glanced out the window. In the middle of the forest stood a pale teenager about 14 years old in khaki shorts, pale, skinny, with bluish lips. Drops of cold rain ran down his face. In his hand he had a dirty bag with something round inside, like a pumpkin. He watched Bruce's car and smiled. Bruce glanced at the road and turned back to the forest, but the teenager was no longer visible. At that moment Bruce thought that the boy was just collecting mushrooms, and that he had a huge mushroom in his bag. At that moment Bruce had no idea how wrong he was. The house that the local realtor picked for him turned out to be an old, creaky bungalow with rotten walls, mold, and trash on every corner. A pile of bottles from under alcohol said that some alcoholic lived here. House was full of his things, which seemed strange. It seemed that the previous owner should return any minute, even the garbage bag was full, but Bruce didn't care. He drank a beer, tried to turn on the non-working TV for 5 minutes, and eventually fell asleep. In the morning he arrived at the local morgue with a new beautiful renovation outside, but completely outdated inside. Mold, peeling paint, collapsing equipment, prints of dirty boots, that's what his new workplace pleased him with. Bruce was met by the local sheriff, told him a couple of routine phrases, left some documents to fill out, and left. There was no one else in the morgue, and Bruce started to do the inventory. The morgue was in complete chaos and disorder. The journals were unfilled, the tools were scattered, the consumables were on the work surfaces. Just like in his house, there was a feeling that the previous forensic doctor just left for 5 minutes in the middle of the workday. And of course there was a body in one of the refrigerators. Without a head. And without an autopsy. Bruce called the sheriff, but he just shrugged, muttering something like, "Yeah, it's all clear, just do the paperwork, so the state will leave us alone." It seemed like the guy decided to chop wood in the forest for his barbecue, but accidentally cut off his head with a chainsaw. Bruce decided not to argue, although for a second he remembered that boy with the bag in the forest. After messing around a little more with the body and organizing the work, Bruce decided that it was enough for today and spent the rest of the working day sitting and watching football on a small TV in the reception. However, the more he sat, the more strange the sheriff's behavior seemed to him. 5 minutes before the end of the working day, he couldn't stand it. Rummaging for a good 20 minutes in the closet and in the cabinets, he finally found some ancient gastroscope. Lowering the camera down the esophagus of the deceased, Bruce saw that all the internal organs were simply destroyed by some sharp objects. In the victim's stomach he saw stones mixed with small branches and feathers, and some bones with strange symbols, similar to runes. Bruce felt uneasy. He had to do an autopsy. This was most likely a murder, and it seemed that the person who did it was not in his right mind. Of course, he had already seen murder victims, but usually they were either obvious results of a shootout between cartels, or poisoning of an unfaithful husband, or accidents. Here it was something new. He called the sheriff, but he didn't answer. Bruce decided that, probably, in a provincial town people are more zealous about their free time. Well, he can postpone it until tomorrow morning. The body should depart tomorrow evening. During the day, he can manage to do an autopsy and rewrite the conclusion. As Bruce drove home, he noticed that there was unusually little traffic on the roads for such a town. Parking the car, he noticed that across from his house, on the neighbor's lawn, stood a girl of about 11 with a huge hairpin and a lush pile of red hair, and silently watched him. Deciding that it was a neighbor's child, Bruce waved his hand. She didn't answer, but just continued to stare. He shrugged and went into the house. In the morning, he was in for an unpleasant surprise. The body had disappeared from the morgue. With trembling hands, Bruce called the sheriff, and he explained to Bruce in a kind and gentle tone that early in the morning they came from the state and took the body, along with his report. They also registered the report in the system as a help to the newcomer, and now there is nothing to worry about. While Bruce was figuring out how to react to such an obvious violation of the procedure, the sheriff continued to praise Bruce. However, when Bruce asked if the body was examined in more detail, the sheriff suddenly changed his tone to a very harsh and peremptory one. He ordered Bruce to do what he was told and not ask questions, and everything would be fine. Bruce was bewildered. It seemed that the sheriff was involved in something, and now he was breaking the law, and because of his careless attitude to work, Bruce also became an accidental accomplice. Before, he just drank on the job, threw scalpels, violated ethics, even once dressed one of the corpses in Santa because they made him work on Christmas night, but it was all for laughs, but to hide the evidence. It was too much. It took Bruce about an hour to just come to his senses and be able to start doing something. He couldn't think of anything better than to go to the place where he saw the boy with the bag. Bruce left the car on the side of the road and went deeper into the forest. After wandering a little between the trees, he found the place where the boy was standing. Near the barely noticeable footprints, there was a dark spot. Bruce touched the spot, rubbed the earth between his fingers. It was dried blood. The boy had a head in his bag, and he clearly knew what had happened. It would be worth finding him and finding out, but on the other hand, Bruce doubted, because he never found out what happened to the previous pathologist. What if the sheriff got rid of him to cover up his crimes? Wandering around this place, Bruce did not notice any other traces or blood stains, nothing. It seemed that the boy appeared in this place and immediately disappeared. Already leaving, Bruce noticed a symbol carved with a knife on the tree, resembling some kind of hieroglyph. He photographed it on his phone. Driving into town, Bruce noticed that a teenager was riding a bike behind him. He had a remarkable vintage Chicago Bulls cap. Bruce stopped to ask him about the rumors in town, but he abruptly turned onto another road. Driving past his house towards the morgue, he noticed his neighbors, an elderly couple. He was mowing the lawn, and she was sitting on the porch. Bruce stopped and greeted them. The man and woman were quite restrained, and Bruce asked them about their children and red-haired granddaughter. The old people looked at each other significantly and replied, "We have neither children nor grandchildren." They immediately dropped all their things and went into the house. They seemed scared. With a sense of impending threat, Bruce reached the morgue. As soon as he put on his robe, there was a noise in the reception. Bruce ran out into the reception. There was the sheriff, and with him another huge guy with the appearance of a pithecanthropus and with a half-cut left ear, which healed incorrectly and now stuck out to the side like a small handle. The sheriff smiled and said, "We brought you a gift," and pushed a gurney with a black bag for bodies on it towards Bruce. Then he pointed to the huge guy and said, "Meet Bruce, this is Van Gogh. We decided not to bother you on the first day and brought the body ourselves." The guy with the damaged ear nodded silently. Bruce also nodded silently in response. The sheriff put his hand on Bruce's shoulder. "We have another incident." This time the sheriff paused and pressed a little harder on Bruce's shoulder. It was a garage door. The sheriff stared at Bruce for another second, then let go and walked out. His assistant followed him. Bruce just sighed heavily. Another violation of the law was evident. He should report this. It seems that something terrible is happening in the town. Bruce dragged the gurney into the mortuary and opened the bag. There was nothing about the garage door here. The man was literally cut in half. And again, there was no head. Judging by the condition, it happened last night, around the same time when Bruce came home. Bruce felt uneasy. He began to gasp for air. He turned on the ventilation to the maximum and sat on a chair. Suddenly the silence was cut by a sharp ring of the phone. "No," Not a mobile, but an old rotary phone of green color, which was covered with dust and stood on the desk in the reception. Bruce picked up the phone. On the other side there was some fuss. "Hello," said Bruce. The fuss continued. "Hello," he repeated. "Can you hear me?" asked a male voice. He made gurgling sounds, as if he had a mouthful of water. "Yes, who is this?" "I'm here," the voice said with difficulty. The gurgling continued. "Here, where?" "On the table," the voice croaked. "Nice joke," Bruce said coldly. During his studies at the medical college, he had encountered such pranks before. "How about this?" said the gurgling voice. The phone interference increased. Suddenly the corpse's hand slipped off his chest and hit the post-mortem examination table. Bruce jumped off the chair. "Left pocket," the voice wheezed and hung up. The phone started to make a long continuous beep, which reminded Bruce of the absence of a pulse in the body. Bruce searched the body for remote servos or other moving mechanisms that would allow such a joke, but found nothing. Nothing but a note in the left pocket. There was an address. Bruce stood with the note of the dead man in the cold chamber and didn't know what to do. The daylight lamp flickered right above him. A small red cockroach crawled onto the table, looked around and immediately disappeared into some crack. Bruce looked at it and also decided to go and look around and immediately disappear. It turned out to be an abandoned youth shelter on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by forest on 3 sides. It was surrounded by a wire fence, the lock on the gate was torn off, pieces of police tape helplessly fluttered in the wind. Bruce entered. There was desolation in the corridors, the wind blew through the shelter. But Bruce understood that he was going towards danger because he felt a faint smell that he knew too well. It was the smell of all dried blood. In the central hall he saw a cross hanging upside down from the ceiling, and under it a huge stain from a pool of blood. The cross was covered with symbols, similar to the one he saw on the tree in the forest and in the body of the first victim he knew of. Around the cross was drawn a huge pentagram. In its vertices were placed small children's chairs, which once were bright and new, but today dull, peeling, broken. On the chairs were prints of miniature teenage palms, bloody prints. Bruce heard some noise behind his back. He turned around. It was the same red-haired girl he had seen in the neighbor's yard. With one hand she held his neighbor, grandfather, by the hand, but with the other hand she held by the hair the head, possibly, of the same guy whose body Bruce received today. In the other hand of the grandfather was a sickle. The girl looked at the grandfather, let go of his hand and pointed at Bruce, and he moved towards the man. Bruce began to retreat, muttering something about legality, but when his neighbor came closer, Bruce saw that instead of eyes the grandfather had some black holes. No, they were not black eyes, shiny and alive like animals. No, it was the darkness itself, which does not reflect a drop of light, having neither reason nor a glimmer of hope or compassion. The grandfather was possessed. He was thin, his lips were eaten away and dark blood dripped from his gums. All his bones seemed to sharpen and protrude through the skin. Bruce turned and ran, and the creature that used to be his neighbor, unexpectedly agile, threw himself after him, waving a sickle and scattering jelly-like saliva around. Running out into the yard, Bruce saw that the sheriff was waiting for him. He had a shotgun in his hands. Bruce tripped over a brick and fell into the mud, almost at the feet of the sheriff, but he did not flinch. Bruce raised his head, expecting the worst. As soon as the possessed grandfather ran out of the shelter, the sheriff fired all 8 rounds of his Mossberg 500 into him. After the last shot, Bruce got up. His knee hurt, and blood seeped through his jeans. The old man no longer looked possessed. His eyes were normal, his gums and bones too. The sheriff reloaded the shotgun, threw it over his shoulder and took the body by the legs, pointing Bruce to the upper part. They silently threw the body into the sheriff's pickup, also silently got into the cabin and drove off. Bruce's car tires were torn to shreds, the hood was lifted and wires were sticking out of it. He had no chance of getting out of there alive, if not for the sheriff. Stunned by what was happening, Bruce tried to gather his thoughts, to accept the reality that he faced. It was something powerful and otherworldly, something that cannot be resisted and that can break you as easily as a match. They also silently unloaded the body and put it on the second autopsy table. The sheriff took off his hat. Bruce decided to break the silence and asked, "A hunting accident?" The sheriff nodded. "I'm tired of this hunting. This is such a wild crap that even in a mad nightmare it is hard to imagine." Bruce weakly sat down on a chair. The walls narrowed around him. The phone rang again. Bruce picked up the phone. "My wife. She's all alone," the voice of the old man, whose lifeless body lay a few yards from Bruce, wheezed. "I understand, but you shouldn't have rushed at me with a sickle," Bruce replied, not noticing that the sheriff was looking at him in shock and already had his hand on the holster. "It is impossible to resist them," the old man could hardly speak coherently. "Where did they come from? Why do these teenagers attack people?" Bruce asked. "Where it all started, there it will end," the grandfather answered and hung up the phone. A long beep. Bruce hung up the phone. "You won't believe who called," he said to the sheriff. "But no one called," the sheriff replied, drilling the pathologist with his gaze. Bruce looked closely at the sheriff. "There was no call," the sheriff repeated. "And tell me about the teenagers." He barely moved his hand, lying on the pistol holster, but did it so that Bruce noticed. For Bruce, it was a revelation that he actually didn't receive any calls. And the sheriff didn't see any teenagers. They just weren't there. It turned out that in the town, randomly, people go crazy, kill others and cut off their heads. The heads disappear, but even if you manage to eliminate the possessed in time, after a while someone else still becomes possessed. The sheriff and his assistant can do nothing with this curse, and the previous pathologist was also possessed and died. But what Bruce told the sheriff was too unrealistic for him, and as soon as Bruce got up from his chair, the sheriff pulled out his gun and aimed at Bruce. Bruce backed away and leaned against the cold tile wall. At that moment, Van Gogh entered the mortuary, who immediately tried to calm the sheriff. The sheriff briefly described to his assistant what was happening with Bruce, and it seemed that Van Gogh was puzzled. It turned out that several victims before becoming possessed also saw children. At first, they wrote it off as a mass psychosis because of the terrible murder in the shelter, which was abandoned after those events and where they had just been. Then a group of children poisoned their teacher and then burned her on a ritual fire. The details were unknown to the sheriff, as the case was almost immediately taken by the feds, who, in his opinion, did nothing, and this caused a new wave of cruelty and madness in the town. Therefore, the sheriff tried to cover up all the information about what was happening in the town, to figure it out himself and not to involve the feds, who did not care about the lives of the locals. No one ever saw those children again, except for those people who later became possessed. Maybe they are dead and Bruce only saw ghosts, or maybe they can move between the real world and the beyond. "So, I can also become possessed soon?" Bruce asked confusedly. "Don't worry, I'll take care of you," the sheriff said with a smile, patting his holster. "It all started in the shelter, so it should end there," Van Gogh said. "Tomorrow we'll get ready and finish this," the sheriff said. "I'll get us a couple of cans of gasoline." He leaned over to Bruce, patted his shoulder. "Rest, and don't go crazy," he joked, and they left with Van Gogh. Bruce was left alone. He decided to write reports and then drove home in Van Gogh's car, which he kindly lent him. After work, Bruce stopped by the store on the way to buy something to eat. He sat in the car in the parking lot and ate a cold and soggy taco bought in the store. A homeless man knocked on the driver's side window. Bruce rolled down the window and gave him $1 or $2. The bald homeless man smiled widely with his almost toothless mouth and handed him a fir cone as a sign of gratitude. Bruce twirled the fir cone in his hands and kept thinking about the story he had gotten himself into. Something didn't add up. There was some inconsistency, some detail was missing. A middle-aged man walked past with a bag of groceries. Most likely he was heading to his car. A moment later, 2 boys about 14 years old walked behind him with a confident, springy gait, their faces hidden under their hoods. The light from the lanterns on the poles sharply outlined their thin shoulders. For Bruce, it reminded him of those videos on the National Geographic Channel when several predators were chasing an unsuspecting prey. Bruce put the cone in his pocket, got out of the car and, taking the wrench with him, followed them. He turned to a nearby van just as one of the guys laughed and swung a bat at the man already lying on the ground. A torn package lay on the ground, food was scattered. The second teenager took out a butterfly knife, grabbed the man by the chest and put the blade to his throat. Bruce saw that a drop of blood appeared on the blade. These teenagers looked too real, and Bruce realized that these were not the ghostly visions he had encountered before. "Get out of here." Bruce tried to sound as authoritative as possible. "Who are you?" The guy with the knife let go of the man and turned towards Bruce. He fell onto the asphalt, making silent moans. The other teenager with a bat in his hand snorted and started to explain to his partner. "Oh, this is that dumb new butcher from the morgue. My dad told me. Don't worry, he won't do anything to us. He's just a sad loser." The guy raised the bat, pointing at Bruce, and continued. "I see you have a weapon. How about one-on-one?" Bruce didn't move. The teenager snorted. "I knew you were a coward." He lifted the hem of his hoodie. On his belt hung a holster with a gun. It was dark enough in the parking lot that it was hard for Bruce to make out, but he thought he had seen this holster before today. "That's right," the teenager muttered through his teeth, leaning forward a little. "In the evenings, my dad gets drunk and passes out until the morning, so at night I'm the sheriff here, I'm the law and order here, got it, jerk?" The second guy smiled contentedly and nodded, looking fanatically at the sheriff's son. "How about we kill this one?" the sheriff's son suggested, pointing a bat at the man on the asphalt. Bruce took a step towards the teens, holding up the wrench. By chance, only a donated fur cone slipped out of his jacket pocket, fell to the floor and rolled towards the teenagers. They stared at the cone, then looked up at Bruce. To be honest, Bruce was expecting some mockery about the lessons of handicrafts from natural materials in elementary school, but suddenly the mood of the teenagers changed. Now they looked quite serious. The sheriff's son lightly kicked the man on the asphalt and told him to get lost. He got up, ran to his car and drove away. Silence fell. "Ready for changes in your life?" asked the sheriff's son. "Become a collector of pine cones from a homeless man?" Bruce joked, hoping to defuse the situation. Although he was determined, he didn't want to fight, let alone get shot. The teenagers looked at each other and laughed. It was a haughty laugh, which usually people have who openly demonstrate their dominance and knowledge of something that the other person does not know. "Welcome to the service, you'll be useful," said the sheriff's son. He rummaged in his pockets and pulled out a small bundle, the size of a lollipop, wrapped in several papers. He threw the bundle to Bruce. The teenagers turned and left. Bruce started to open the bundle, but it was taped. Probably coke, Bruce thought, but the reality was worse. It was a human phalange bone with a rune on it, just like the ones he found inside the victims. It seems that the sheriff's son is directly involved in these murders, which most likely have a ritual character. There was no point in going to the sheriff right now, if you believe the words of the juvenile criminal. On the other hand, there is also no evidence that the sheriff is innocent. Bruce felt that he was too involved in this whole situation, and he couldn't just run away from the town, then he would be charged with a lot of crimes and he would definitely get life. And how to explain those supernatural phenomena that Bruce encountered. Visions, calls, possessed, here you don't even have to think about the court, this is a direct way to the loony bin. Bruce returned to his car. He threw the cone on the dashboard and drove to his place. On the doorstep of his neighbor stood his wife and waited for her husband. Bruce stopped, got out of the car and approached her. She looked at his face, understood everything and immediately burst into tears. Bruce hugged the unfortunate old woman. He tried to calm her down, but he had a hard time doing it. Suddenly he noticed on her table near the door, next to a bowl with keys, the same fur cone as his. It turned out that her husband, before leaving and not returning, brought this cone from the street. Why and for what, he did not explain, but what was strange, pine trees did not grow in the town. In a state of tense expectation, Bruce returned to his home. He sat in an old armchair, twisted the cone in his hands and realized that he had little time left. He spent the night in a half-forgotten state in front of the TV, which still barely worked, but he did not fall asleep. Sometimes Bruce seemed to see that several teenagers had stood near the window and watched him, whispered something and reached out to him with their long thin arms, but when he shone there with a flashlight, he found nothing. Surely, stress and fatigue were taking their toll. In the morning, Bruce woke up from two equally strong sensations. The first one was an unusually strong feeling of hunger, which he had never experienced before. He went to the kitchen, opened the fridge. Despite this feeling, he was completely indifferent to the products he saw there, even the cheese braid. The second thing he felt was a spicy smell of pumpkin pie with either caramel or vanilla. It was the same smell that he remembered from his childhood, when his mother once made such a pie for Thanksgiving and the whole family sat at the table, joked, it was so warm and cozy. The smell came from his jacket, which he wore yesterday. Bruce hurried to it and started nervously searching the pockets. He found a tiny parchment bundle in his pocket. With trembling fingers, Bruce quickly unwrapped the small delicious piece of that very pie. Without thinking, as if in a trance, he swallowed it. If he could look in the mirror at that moment, he would be enveloped in horror because in fact Bruce swallowed the very phalange bone with a rune that the sheriff's son gave him yesterday. Bruce was torn out of his trance by a knock on the door. It was the sheriff. The men arrived at the abandoned youth shelter. The sheriff called the firefighters and they assured him that they would not come. There was no one around. They carried cans of gasoline inside and began to pour it, most of all in the central hall. When the job was done, the men stood in the yard, the sheriff lit a match and threw it. A fire flared up, which quickly spread. They stood and watched as the fire devoured the shelter. Suddenly Bruce felt someone's small icy and wet hand take his hand. A feeling of overwhelming fear gripped him. He looked down. It was a boy of about 10, with braces and a shirt. His palms were bloody. He looked pitifully at Bruce. You have to protect us, the boy said. Bruce shook his head and the vision disappeared. Are you okay? The sheriff asked. This is not the place where it all started, Bruce said and went to the car. The sheriff and Van Gogh exchanged glances. Bruce understood that as soon as the sheriff suspected his possession, he would face a bullet. They arrived at the morgue. Bruce picked up the phone, but only heard a long beep. It was worth a try. Bruce hung up the phone and nervously tapped his fingers on the phone. Sheriff, do you think any teenagers could really be involved in this cult? Bruce asked. I mean, real people, not those visions that I see. The sheriff clenched his teeth. Van Gogh looked confused. Let's get to the point, the sheriff growled. I mean, teenagers are everywhere and they can see and know more than we do. Bruce still hesitated to say it straight. Listen here, you damn Yankee, my family's problems are none of your business. The sheriff yelled, losing his temper. He moved toward Bruce. Van Gogh held him back. He had a bone like these. Bruce shouted back, pointing to the objects extracted from the body. Everyone has family problems, but you might know something and he can help us. And we can help him. Don't you dare get close to him or I'll shoot you, the sheriff waved his fist in the air. Yeah, your psycho can handle it himself. He runs around the town with your gun every night, while you lie drunk as a skunk, Bruce snapped. The sheriff lunged at him, but Van Gogh pushed him back again. Shut up, both of you. The big guy roared. The sheriff sat down on a chair and wrapped his head in his hands. It was clear that this tragedy with his son had deeply traumatized him. He was a good boy, always did the right thing, tried to study, played soccer. He just got carried away with all these outings to abandoned buildings, but he's a guy, a man, we all need to get out sometimes. Everything changed in one night. He didn't talk, but now I understand that night they were in that damn shelter and something happened there. He became withdrawn, aggressive, started killing pets. The last 2 weeks I haven't seen him at all, but I guessed he came by, because food was missing from the fridge. I thought he just came to eat, poor boy. The sheriff fell silent. Maybe we should look for him? I saw him near the supermarket, Bruce said. We can help him. The sheriff nodded his head. He got up, straightened his shoulders. It seemed that he managed to pull himself together. There are a couple more places where he was seen. We'll check. The sheriff and Van Gogh left, and Bruce began the autopsy. Maybe it will give more answers than can be expected. Inside the bodies he found the same crumpled feathers, branches, stones, and runes. It felt like it was all from some nest, which they fed the victims to break their will and subdue them. Bruce washed the blood off his work gloves when he suddenly heard a child's voice. It was just a prank. Children should be forgiven. He turned sharply. On the chair sat a boy in a white shirt and pants with suspenders. "Where's the head?" Bruce asked. "We needed for Mom to come back," the child said. There was a noise in the reception. Bruce turned his head to the door for a moment, but the child had already disappeared. Bruce went to the exit. "They, heads? What did he mean?" The sheriff was in the reception. He had no face. On the cart was another body without a head. By the build-in clothes, Bruce realized that it was Van Gogh. "A homeless man attacked him. I couldn't help," the sheriff said bitterly. The bald freak managed to escape. The sheriff's fists clenched with impotence. "We will avenge," Bruce said. They fell silent. Bruce continued. "It seems they are preparing for some ritual. Help me." They wheeled the body into the cold chamber. Bruce showed his findings, but the sheriff had no more ideas what it all meant. The sheriff could not attend the autopsy of his friend and left to wait in the reception. Bruce did not find anything new, the same as the others. The only thing left to hope for was the ghostly calls from the other side. They sat with the sheriff in the reception and waited. It was already past midnight when the phone rang. "Feathers, branches, runes, what do you know about this?" Bruce started right away with a hook, knowing that the call would be short. "It all started there," Van Gogh answered. "There is where?" Bruce asked. "Where it all started," Van Gogh croaked. "Who is the mother?" "She ascended with fire, and will return with fire, and bring her children." Van Gogh's voice was increasingly drowned out by interference. He fell silent and barely audibly added, "At the end, Susie will no longer be sad." A long beep interrupted the rasp of interference. "Well?" the sheriff asked impatiently. "Not much." "Who is Susie and why is she sad?" The sheriff thought. "I only know one Susie. A long time ago she adopted a girl found in the forest, raised her, paid for her college education. This girl was the teacher who those damn cultists sacrificed. It seems to me, there is not everything so clear. It seems she was not even a victim, but the one who started it all. I'm not surprised by anything." "What else?" "Something about fire, but I didn't understand," Bruce lied, although in fact he suddenly didn't want to say anything more to the sheriff. Bruce suddenly realized that the sheriff was a disgusting, vile and powerful person. A useless lump of biomass that would not be a pity to dispose of. Such people will not make the world better. They will not be able to take care of the future. Such people will not love children. "Hey, are you okay?" the sheriff asked. You suddenly hung up on half a word. Bruce's stream of thoughts was interrupted, and he was horrified to find that someone else had just instilled these thoughts in him. "We have little time, we have to go, talk to Susie," he said with difficulty. They took Van Gogh's car, the sheriff's pickup broke down, and they left it near the morgue. It was about 3 in the morning. Strong gusts of wind carried garbage along the street. The sheriff and Bruce knocked on Susie's door for 10 minutes. "Susie, this is the sheriff. This is very urgent," the sheriff repeated every minute. Eventually, the old lady opened the door. While the sheriff was leading a meaningless social conversation and cautiously approaching the main questions, Bruce examined the photos on the wall. In one of them he noticed that Susie and her daughter were playing on some forest edge near a ravine. "Oh, this is the place where they found the baby," Susie answered his question. The poor thing was always drawn back to that place. "There are fir trees there, right? Not pines, like everywhere else?" Bruce asked. "Yes, exactly," the old lady answered. She got up, limped across the room. The sheriff approached Bruce and muttered through his teeth, "Don't interfere, you'll ruin everything." Bruce leaned over to him and whispered, "My old neighbor was given a fur cone before he became possessed." "Nonsense at all," the sheriff replied. Bruce nodded. "Maybe, but me too." Bruce hesitated for a second, wondering if it was worth talking about it, but still decided to say. "It was bald. Homeless. Die. What the hell didn't you say before?" The angry sheriff loomed over Bruce. A thin voice in Bruce's head quietly whispered, "See how evil he is. He is a monster. He must be killed." "And this is a gift from that edge." Susie returned to the living room. The men flinched, as if returning to reality. It was the same fur cone as Bruce received as a gift. Saying goodbye to Susie, who did not understand why this night visit was, the men got into the pickup. They went for gasoline and weapons, and an hour later they walked down the steep slope towards the same ravine. The clouds hung low in the sky, pressing against the tops of the trees. Finding nothing on the edge, they decided to descend into the ravine between the hills, and there they found it. Hidden behind two protruding boulders and sticking stones, the pagan shrine resembled a place of execution. In the center stood a figure dedicated to some goddess of chaos, consisting of collected branches, feathers, and stones with runes drawn on them. Everything matched the items that Bruce found inside the victims. Around the figure were stakes. On each stake was someone's head, and to each stake were attached familiar things to Bruce: shorts like the very first boy he saw, a girl's hairpin, a Chicago Bulls cap, braces, suspenders of the last teenager he saw. There were other things, but he did not meet those teenagers, or maybe he just did not pay attention as they watched him from the crowd. It seemed that for the existence of each ghost, a thing and someone's head were needed. The sheriff threw up. Suddenly a figure emerged from the dark. It was the bald homeless man. He had two more teenagers with him, but they had no common things with the things on the ritual stakes. They seemed real. The homeless man laughed. His eyes were as black as the eyes of Bruce's dead neighbor. "Are they real?" Bruce asked the sheriff quietly. The child's whisper in his head grew louder. "Johnny, son," the sheriff's voice broke. "Go home, you promised. Mom is waiting for you." It was visible how the sheriff's hands were shaking, tears were in his eyes. One of the boys turned to him. "Forgive me, Father. My real mother is here and she is calling me," Johnny answered and flicked a lighter. "No!" The sheriff shouted and was about to rush to his son to stop him, but Bruce, obeying someone's will, tripped him and he fell. The figure of the goddess of chaos began to burn. Bruce seemed to see her start to move her arms. The teenagers and the homeless man ran into the woods. The sheriff, torn by contradictions, began to shoot at them, hoping with all his soul to miss his son. The sound of the last shot was different. It was somehow closer and with a different timbre. Bruce realized this only when he looked down. He had a smoking gun in his hand, given to him by the sheriff the day before. Obeying someone else's will, which almost subdued Bruce, he unknowingly shot the sheriff. A wave of horror and regret swept over him. In a rage, he tore out one of the stakes. It seemed to be the one where Van Gogh's head was. With this stake he began to smash the figure of the goddess. Pieces of the figure fell to the ground, on the sheriff and on Bruce himself. Being in some wild trance and not remembering himself, he destroyed the entire pagan shrine. Going a little further, he noticed 3 bodies, the homeless man and the last 2 adepts of this gloomy cult. He piled up all the bodies and evidence, poured gasoline over everything and set it on fire. He did not wait until everything burned down and drove to his home. He lay in the shower under streams of cold water. His chest was shaken by sobs of pain and repentance. It continued until he passed out from exhaustion. The sun rose, dispelling the morning fog. Along the forest by the highway to the direction of Grangeville walked a lonely woman of about 30 in a black dress. A minivan slowed down near her. The window opened slightly and a pretty woman asked, "Do you need help? Are you lost?" "Yes, please," the woman in the black dress answered softly and velvety. "My car stalled and I have no one to ask for help." "Oh, don't worry." "Ben, brake," the woman ordered her husband. "Sit in the back, You can chat with our son, Alan. What is your name? The woman in the dress smiled. She had perfectly even and beautiful teeth. Oh, I love children. I used to work in a youth shelter. It was wonderful. And my name is Susie, in honor of my mother. She got into the car. Hi, Alan, look what I have, she said and handed the child a fur cone. The door closed and the minivan slowly moved away.